stopping eating after 6 p.m. Most people lose weight in week 1 then stall completely, not because of willpower, not because of the wrong foods, because of one hormonal miscalculation nobody is talking about. Calculation nobody is talking about. I've been double board certified for over 2 decades. I've watched patients do everything right, cut calories, shrink the eating window, hit the gym, and still carry the same stubborn weight around their midsection, year after year. When we looked at what was actually happening inside their cells during those overnight hours, we found something that changes everything. Most people are accidentally triggering their fat storage system right before they fall asleep. Every single night. What I'm about to show you is based on research out of Stanford and Northwestern. Research that nobody in this space has connected to nighttime eating. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here's what's actually happening inside your body, and why the timing you're eating cutoff matters more than the calories you're cutting. Your body runs on a 24-hour hormonal clock. The most important hormone on that clock isn't insulin. It isn't leptin, it's cortisol. I know, you've heard that word. Stress hormone, belly fat, bad. That's the surface story. Here's the real one. Cortisol follows a precise curve every single day. It hits its lowest point between midnight and 3 a.m. Then it spikes peaks about 30 to 45 minutes after you wake up and gradually falls through the day. That low point at night, that trough, that is not passive. That is an active biological instruction. Stanford researchers identified a molecular switch inside your precursor fat cells. Cells that haven't yet decided whether to become permanent fat storage units or stay dormant. That switch flips into fat storage mode permanently if your cortisol stays elevated for more than 12 consecutive hours without dropping. 12 hours. That's the threshold. Your 6 p.m. eating cutoff is supposed to protect that trough. Less food, less digestion, less insulin, lower cortisol. Fat cells stay dormant.
The switch stays off?
But here's where most people collapse the entire system. Even a small late meal triggers an insulin response. That response keeps your metabolism active at exactly the time it's scheduled to power down. Cortisol doesn't fall. The trough gets compressed. Night after night, those precursor fat cells stop waiting and convert into active, storage-ready fat cells, completely independent of your calorie count. The when is as powerful as the what. So what's actually collapsing the trough? The answer is something so routine, nobody flags it as a problem. So what's collapsing the trough? What's keeping cortisol elevated at the exact hours your body needs it to fall? The answer is something so routine that nobody questions it. Your morning coffee. Not coffee itself, the timing of it. Here's what almost nobody tells you. In the first 30 to 45 minutes after waking, your body is already producing the highest cortisol concentration it will generate all day. It's called the cortisol awakening response, the CAR. This is your body's built-in ignition system. It mobilizes glucose. It sharpens focus. It signals every major organ that the day has begun. It is a precise, elegantly timed biological event, and most people pour caffeine directly on top of it. Caffeine doesn't just block fatigue signals in the brain. It stimulates your pituitary gland to release more the hormone that instructs your adrenal glands to produce more cortisol. So when you stack caffeine on an already peaking cortisol response, you're not getting an energy boost. You're creating an artificial hormonal surge that pushes your cortisol curve higher than it was ever designed to go. And your body pays for that later. Now here's where this connects directly to your 6 p.m. cutoff and why this single habit can silently unravel the entire protocol. Caffeine has an average half-life of 5 hours in the human body. A cup at 8 a.m. still carries a measurable hormonal footprint well into early afternoon. A cup at noon, still biologically active at 5 p.m. A second or third cup past 2 p.m., which most people are having without thinking twice, is chemically interfering with the cortisol decline your overnight fast depends on. The trough never fully forms. The molecular switch never fully resets. You wake up the next morning, having done everything. Right, stopped eating at 6, went to bed on time, but your fat cells spent the entire night receiving a continuous storage signal because the cortisol curve never bottomed out the way it needed to. This is why caffeine timing is one of the most underestimated variables in the entire intermittent fasting conversation. There's research showing that habitual daily caffeine consumers develop a blunted natural cortisol rhythm. Over time, their bodies become dependent on exogenous stimulants to initiate morning metabolic processes. The natural car weakens, the curve flattens, and the trough that your 6 p.m. cutoff is designed to protect gets shorter and shallower with every passing month. It's not about cutting coffee. It's about understanding that your morning cup is a hormonal event, one that needs to be timed like one. Delay it 90 minutes after waking, after the car has peaked and begun its natural descent, and you're working with your biology. Consume it the moment you open your eyes, and you're working against it. Every single morning. But mistimed caffeine is only the first layer compounding this problem, because there's a second factor, and this one lives inside the fat cells themselves. And once you understand it, you'll realize why some people can't lose visceral fat, no matter what they do. So now you understand the first layer. Mistimed caffeine blunts the cortisol decline. The trough gets compressed. The fat storage switch stays active through the night. But here's what makes this genuinely hard to reverse, even after you fix your coffee timing. Inside your visceral fat cells, the fat wrapped around your organs, the fat that shows up first as a thickening waistline, there is an enzyme. It's called 11-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1. Here's what it does in plain language. It takes inactive cortisone, the stored, harmless version of cortisol, and converts it back into active cortisol. Inside the fat cell itself, locally, without any signal from your brain, without any signal from your adrenal glands, which means this. Even on a day when your blood cortisol looks completely normal, even on a day your doctor would call healthy, your visceral fat cells can be sitting in a private bath of self-generated cortisol that never shows up on any test your doctor orders. And it compounds. The more visceral fat you accumulate, the more of this enzyme you produce. The more enzyme, the more local cortisol. The more local cortisol, the more a second enzyme, lipoprotein lipase, gets activated. And lipoprotein lipase is the biological gatekeeper that physically pulls fatty acids out of your bloodstream and locks them into permanent fat storage. This is a self-reinforcing cycle. Your fat tissue is running its own private cortisol factory, independent of your stress levels, independent of your sleep quality, independent of what you ate that day. That is why visceral fat is so stubborn. It isn't just stored energy waiting to be burned. It is hormonally active tissue generating the very signal that keeps it growing. Now, you may have heard that the answer here is to simply lower cortisol. The supplement industry has built a billion-dollar business on exactly that promise. In 2004 and again in 2007, the Federal Trade Commission took legal action against the makers of Cortislim and Cortistress. These products claimed cortisol control was the answer to losing 10 to 50 pounds. The FTC found zero competent scientific evidence supporting those claims. Settlements totaled over $25 million in fines because you cannot block cortisol, and a healthy body should never try. Cortisol is not the enemy. Chronically mistimed, chronically elevated cortisol is. The legitimate research points somewhere far more precise. Ashwagandha, specifically the KSM-66 standardized root extract at 300 to 600 milligrams daily, has multiple randomized controlled trials and a recent meta-analysis behind it confirming meaningful reductions in serum cortisol over 8 weeks. Not elimination, modulation. There is a significant clinical difference between those two words. But here's the critical point. Most people miss, even after they fix the supplements, the coffee timing, and the eating window. None of it fully works if you're destroying the trough from a completely different direction. One that has nothing to do with what you're eating or drinking. It has to do with light, specifically what your eyes are receiving, in the 2 hours before you fall asleep. Because what's happening in your visual system every night is quietly overriding every other intervention you've stacked. And the downstream effect on your fat cells is something most physicians never think to mention. Let's zoom out, because what we've been covering, the compressed trough, the mistimed caffeine, the private cortisol factory running inside your visceral fat, these are not isolated problems. They are dominoes, and what they're knocking over is much larger than belly fat. Here's the framework your body is actually operating inside. Every hormone, every enzyme, every cellular repair process in your body is synchronized by a master clock in your brain. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This clock has one primary input, not food, not exercise, light, specifically the ratio of bright light to darkness across a 24-hour period. When that ratio is accurate, your cortisol curve is accurate, your insulin sensitivity is accurate. Your fat cells behave exactly the way they're supposed to behave. But when that ratio is wrong, even modestly, even without full sleep deprivation, something happens inside your fat cells that most physicians never discuss. Research published earlier this year out of Northwestern University found that circadian disruption impairs the mitochondria inside adipocytes. The mitochondria, the energy conversion machinery inside every fat cell. When your circadian clock is off, that machinery gets jammed. The fat cell loses its biological ability to oxidize stored energy, not because of what you ate, because of when your light exposure was mistimed. Read that again. Your fat cells stop burning stored energy, not from overeating, but from a disrupted light environment. This is why two people can follow the identical 6 p.m. eating cutoff with an identical calorie deficit and produce completely different results. One of them is protecting their circadian rhythm. The other is flooding their retinas with blue light at 10 p.m., suppressing melatonin, keeping cortisol artificially elevated, and unknowingly disabling the fat oxidation machinery inside every adipocyte in their body. Same protocol, completely different biology. And here's what makes this the escalation point, the reason this matters, beyond a stubborn waistline. Mitochondrial dysfunction in fat cells doesn't stay contained to fat cells. It is one of the earliest measurable signals of systemic metabolic disease. It precedes insulin resistance. It precedes type 2 diabetes. It precedes cardiovascular inflammation. Your body sends this signal years, sometimes decades, before a diagnosis appears on a lab report. The waistline that won't move is not a cosmetic problem. It is a red flag. Your body waving it as loudly as it can with the tools it has available. And the research is now clear that restoring circadian alignment, protecting that light-to-dark ratio, is not optional for metabolic recovery. It is foundational. The 6 p.m. eating cutoff works, but only inside a circadian container that's intact. Without that container, you are running a precision protocol inside a broken system. Which brings us to the part I rarely talk about publicly. Because for years, despite everything, I knew I was making every single one of these mistakes myself. I want to be honest with you, because I spent years giving advice on intermittent fasting that was technically correct and practically incomplete. And I know that because I was living proof of the gap. I was doing everything right. Eating window closed by 6 p.m., clean whole foods, consistent training. I understood the hormonal literature better than most physicians in this space. And I was still carrying stubborn weight around my midsection that would not move. My energy was inconsistent in a way I couldn't explain. I'd wake at 3 a.m. with my mind already running at full speed. I'd feel completely wired at 11 p.m. and barely functional at 9 a.m. Classic signs, in retrospect, of an inverted cortisol curve, a trough that had essentially disappeared. And like most physicians who hit a personal health wall, my first instinct was to add more. More restriction, longer fasting windows, a second training session, more aggressive carbohydrate cuts. I pushed my eating cutoff earlier. I layered intervention on top of intervention. Every single one of them added more physiological stress to an HPA axis. that was already running at its ceiling. The weight didn't move. What moved was my testosterone. Down. My recovery capacity. Gone. My sleep architecture, the deep, slow-wave sleep, where genuine cellular repair happens completely fragmented. I was doing more. My body was getting worse. It wasn't until I stopped adding and started reading the totality of the available evidence, not just the fasting research in isolation, but the chronobiology literature, the circadian fat cell studies, the cortisol timing data coming out of Stanford and Northwestern, that I understood what was actually missing. I wasn't failing the protocol. The protocol was incomplete without the circadian layer. The first change I made had nothing to do with food. I got outside within 15 minutes of waking direct morning sunlight. No sunglasses to anchor my central clock before anything else happened. I moved my first coffee to 90 minutes after waking. I let the cortisol awakening response peak and begin its natural descent before I added any exogenous stimulant on top of it. And I made the evening non-negotiable. Blue light blocking from 8 p.m. Warm, dim lighting only. Screens off at least 60 minutes before sleep. No new diet. No new supplement protocol. No additional training load. Within 3 weeks, something shifted that years of dietary intervention had never produced. I was falling asleep faster, staying asleep deeper, and for the first time, the 6 p.m. eating cutoff was actually delivering what it promised, because the hormonal environment it depends on was finally being protected all the way through to morning. The eating window hadn't changed. The circadian container around it had. That distinction between the protocol and the environment that makes the protocol work is what I wish someone had handed me a decade earlier. Because the fix is not complicated, and here is exactly what it looks like in practice. Here's what actually works, and why it's simpler than everything you've already tried. Everything we've covered, the 12-hour trough, the mistimed caffeine, the enzymatic cortisol factory inside visceral fat, the jammed mitochondria in your adipocytes, it all converges into 5 behavioral corrections. Sequenced, timed, and designed to work with your hormonal architecture instead of against it. Call it a circadian stack, not a supplement stack, not another meal plan. A set of daily behaviors timed to restore the biological conditions your 6 p.m. eating cutoff was always designed to operate inside. Lever 1. Morning light. Within 15 minutes of waking, before coffee, before your phone, before anything, get outside. Eyes to natural daylight. No sunglasses. Even on an overcast day, outdoor light delivers 10 times the photon intensity of indoor lighting. This single behavior sets your suprachiasmatic nucleus, locks the cortisol awakening response onto its correct trajectory, and starts the 12 to 14-hour biological countdown that determines when your body is genuinely ready for sleep. Get this right, and every downstream intervention becomes more effective. Get this wrong, and nothing else fully compensates. Lever 2. Caffeine timing. 90 minutes after waking. Not immediately. Not with your alarm. 90 minutes. That window is when your cortisol awakening response is peaking and beginning its natural descent. Caffeine consumed before that descent stacks an artificial surge on top of a natural one, overshooting the curve, accelerating the afternoon crash, and leaving residual cortisol activity that compresses your overnight trough before you've even eaten dinner. Delay by 90 minutes and caffeine does what it was designed to do: supplement a fading alertness signal, not replace a biological one. Hard cutoff at 2 p.m. Non-negotiable. With a 5-hour half-life, anything consumed after 2 p.m. is still hormonally active at 7 p.m., working directly against the cortisol decline your eating cutoff depends on. Lever 3. Evening light. From 8 p.m. onward, your visual system needs to stop receiving blue spectrum light. Blue light at night suppresses melatonin and signals your suprachiasmatic nucleus that it is still midday. Cortisol stays elevated. The trough gets pushed back. Your fat cells receive a continuous storage signal through what should be their deepest recovery window. Blue light blocking glasses, warm amber bulbs, screens off 60 minutes before bed. These are not biohacking luxuries. They are the minimum viable conditions for your eating cutoff to deliver the results it promises. Lever 4. Movement timing. Keep high-intensity training in the morning or early afternoon. Prolonged aerobic work above 60% of VO2 max elevates cortisol significantly and keeps it elevated for over an hour into recovery. Done in the evening, that spike lands directly inside your trough window. In the evening walk, low-intensity movement activates your parasympathetic nervous system, accelerates cortisol's natural decline, and prepares your adipose tissue for the overnight fat oxidation your cutoff is trying to unlock. Lever 5. Adaptogenic support if your stress load is chronically high. Ashwagandha. KSM 66 standardized root extract, 300 to 600 milligrams daily. Multiple randomized controlled trials. A recent meta-analysis confirming meaningful serum cortisol reductions over 8 weeks. It does not block cortisol. It modulates the HPA axis response, smoothing the peaks without flattening the curve. That distinction matters clinically. These 5 levers stacked in sequence create the circadian container that transforms stopping eating after 6 p.m. from a calorie restriction strategy into a full hormonal reset, one your fat cells can finally respond to. And when they do respond, when that trough holds for 12 or more consecutive hours, night after night, what happens inside your body goes well beyond anything the scale measures. Here is what actually happens to your body when you get this right. Day 7, your sleep changes. Not longer deeper. You stop waking at 3 a.m. with your mind already running. That wired but exhausted feeling you've normalized for years, the one you assumed was just stress, just age, just how you are now starts to lift. That is your cortisol trough reforming, your HPA axis beginning to reset, your body remembering what genuine overnight recovery feels like. Day 14, your energy shifts. Not the artificial spike you get from caffeine stacked on a cortisol surge. Something quieter. Steadier. An alertness that's available from the moment you wake up without needing anything external to ignite it. That is your cortisol awakening response, functioning cleanly, the way it was designed to before years of mistimed stimulants and compressed troughs eroded it. Day 30. Something changes in the mirror that the scale sometimes hasn't caught up to yet. The midsection starts to shift, not because you restricted more, not because you trained harder, because for the first time in potentially years, your visceral fat cells spent 30 consecutive nights inside a hormonal environment that signaled release instead of store. The molecular switch Stanford identified, the one governed by that 12-hour trough, finally had enough uninterrupted time to reset completely. That is what 30 days of stopping eating after 6 p.m. actually does to your body. Not a diet result, a biological recalibration, a fundamental shift in what your cells are being instructed to do while you sleep, and it compounds. Every night the trough holds, the signal gets cleaner. Every morning the car fires correctly, the cascade downstreams gets sharper. The fat cells that spent years locked in storage mode start behaving the way they were always supposed to behave. Your energy, your sleep, your waistline, they are going to keep getting better and better. But here is what I need you to understand before you start. The eating cutoff is the entry point, not the destination. What you eat inside that window determines how fast and how completely your body responds. Because if you're spiking glucose aggressively during your eating hours, even with the cutoff in place, even with the circadian stack honored, you are creating an insulin environment that works directly against everything the overnight fast is trying to accomplish. Insulin suppresses the very enzymes your body needs to access stored fat. High insulin and a protected trough are pulling in opposite directions, and insulin wins. The interaction between your eating window and your food choices, specifically how different foods affect your glucose curve and your insulin response hour by hour, is the next layer of this entirely. It is the variable that separates people who see good results from people who see results they cannot explain to anyone around them. I put together a complete breakdown of exactly how to structure what you eat inside your window for maximum hormonal effect. Every food category, every timing decision, the full picture. Watch that next. It starts exactly where this one ends.